My name's Hugh Foley, as you see on your program there. I'm a professor of fine arts at Rogers State University in Claremore, Oklahoma, known for being the home of Will Rogers, if you know the great American humorist, Patti Page, great singer of years gone by. So I'm happy to be here today, very excited about it. And first, I can't even go a step without acknowledging my friend and colleague, brother Willie Ruff, who really brought us all here together today. Without him, I don't think we're here, to be honest. And of course, Diane for putting everything together, and Callum for leading that great presentation this morning. And where'd he go? Is he still here, Callum? Oh, there you are, over there. Sorry. Yeah. And the only thing, Diane, I don't know if I should be following Dwayne or not. You know, that's kind of a rough act to follow, but do the best I can up here. And also, I appreciated Doug's presentation earlier today. Excellent, learning about some of the early religious history of the Scots, specifically coming over with regard to the Presbyterians. Dwayne, let's give Dwayne another hand. I was just saying it was tough following you. You know, it's been a tough act to follow there. So I appreciate the work that you did in that presentation. Well, I am a college professor, so there are other college professors in the crowd. You know what happens once you get started. It's hard to slow us down for 45 or 50 minutes, so I'll do my best to get through this material. I've learned a lot today that's fed my scholarship and my thinking and writing in the future. I am a member of a Muskogee Creek Baptist Church. My son is an enrolled member of the Muskogee Creek Nation, and so that's the way in which I came to learn about the world of the Muskogee Creek Nation. And I'll just ask if you would hit play on this particular video. Before I start my talk on the hymns, once it kind of buffers up here, I'd like for you to see the traditional music of the southeastern United States. This is a public social educational environment. It's called the stomp dance popularly. Traditionally, as the text says, the dances would occur outside, around a fire, all night long. It's what was known as the green corn ceremonial. You didn't celebrate the harvest of the corn, you celebrated the corn turning green because that means you're going to be able to harvest it. So the dance is led by a man in the center, and then he's followed by his immediate supporters. Then the remainder of the dancers, alternating man, woman, man, woman. The women wear shell shakers around their legs. Some lyrics are from tribal languages and some are vocables. They are often the expressions that are on the person's mind and really can't be interpreted. In this dance, the leader you see is in the white cowboy hat and the purple shirt in the center of the circle. This is recorded at the University of Oklahoma. Every year they have a spring social stomp dance, and a lot of the traditional people from around Oklahoma who are part of these tribes, the southeastern tribes, come together for education, socializing, and that sort of thing. The rhythm that you hear is by the shells or cans that are being worn by the women around their ankles, and they keep the rhythm. Only the men sing. As mentioned before, the fire is the prayer vehicle, if you will. So the songs are prayers, and the smoke carries the prayers up to the Creator. So when the missionaries arrive to the Creek Nation a couple of hundred years ago, this is what they see the people doing. And this is what they want to immediately separate them from. It's non-Christian, it's heathenish. Are they worshiping a fire out in the center of all that? Well, you can imagine how missionaries may have tried to explain that to native people regarding the symbolism of the fire, especially in the Bible. But I want you to see this because this is the active and living music of the people of the Southeast, the Cherokee, the Seminole, the Muskogee, and has been here since time immemorial, as they say, and will continue on. But I often say that it's not the only music of the American Indian. There's a lot of other music, but it's a call and response fashion. The man in the center says a phrase, the men respond with a chorus. The women are keeping the rhythm. Okay, so if we may, I'd like to take that off, just so you can get a taste of it. You can look up Muskogee Stomp Dance if you'd like on YouTube and find that. And we'll go ahead and start the PowerPoint. I guess I need my clicker. I've spent a lot of time over the last several years working on presentations on Muskogee Creek hymns for all kinds of different organizations with all kinds of different educational backgrounds. Muskogee Creeks themselves, for whom the hymns have not always been a strong, what would I say, they're not respected by everybody. Why is that? Because they're not the original tradition of the Muskogee Creeks. The Muskogee Creek hymn tradition was forced on to them in many ways. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that. But I've also done a lot of presentations for non-Indian audiences, non-Creek tribal audiences, and part of my classes. And then I was very fortunate to talk with Willie and his crew regarding the subject for the documentary that you saw, and we all got to go up to Yale and do our presentation there. So you've learned a lot today that I would normally tell people. So we can jump through a few things that I might ordinarily share, but we just want to make sure that we're all together on this commonality of singing being a meditational pathway to spiritual enlightenment. No matter what part of the world you come from, no matter what your religion is, ethnicity, etc., it is an important aspect of worship for many different backgrounds. Let's see if our clicker's working. All right. Also, I've heard throughout the day there are a lot of very experienced musical people here, highly educated, so you don't necessarily need that for those few of you, but for some of you who don't have that education, when we talk about melismatic singing, applying several pitches to one syllable. We've heard a lot of that in the various presentations that we've heard today, and also the idea of diatonic singing, using, not like you think of a piano, the white and the black keys, but then there's notes in between those notes. You know, a trombone player, so there's all these notes that go in between the notes. And human voice, we can hit a lot of those notes, unlike an instrument like the piano where you're stuck, you know, with the white or the black key. So you want to bring those up, and you now know about the lined out hymns, this basic definition, so I'm not going to hold on that. I want to bring up some Muskogee singing though. Let's just start with one, that way you can hear a little bit of how some of these hymns sound. And I have a couple directions to go, but I realized I had a recording from our last church service on April 5th, and I was playing a little bit of it as you came in. Now this is not this song. This is what it sounds like at our little church, our little Muskogee Creek Indian Baptist Church. I just wanted to get a sense of it. That's what you were listening to when you came in here earlier. I want to point out this song because I was talking to Alan earlier, and we were talking about some of the things I noticed in his presentation that are very much like some of our Creek hymns. So I want to sing a little bit of this one for you. Ilga istit doitus, which is the Creek for and must this body die. And there are a couple, along with trying to learn to read Gaelic today, we also have some things to learn with Muskogee Creek. The B is an sound. And what else do you need to know? The R has kind of a flut sound. But this is one of the Creek hymns that I learned that they told us right off the bat was one of the hardest ones. And I wondered why, and as I started to learn it, this is one that we often sing at funerals, and that means usually it's the older people who are at the funerals who can sing this kind of song. And when Willie, Professor Bruff, brought the video of the first conference down to our church singers, as soon as they heard it, they said, that's Ilga Istit. That's what they instantly thought of. And it has melismatic singing, and it takes its time. I'll start right here. Ilga Istit, oh yes, how do we get there? How did all this happen? Well, we shouldn't go too far without remembering where our whole reason for singing these hymns starts with in the first place, which is Christianity. When they sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. And that starts the process for Jesus to become who he has become for us. Most of you know the Christian music path, how it all evolves through time. The Gregorian chants of the Latin Church and the Church of England, the Reformation, creating songs in the people's language instead of Latin. Encourages congregational singing, the Lutheran hymn tradition. All these are part of this development. If I seem like I'm going a little fast through this, I'm happy to forward this presentation to anybody who would like it. So you send me an email, or I'll send it to Diane, and you can have it. I just don't want us to dwell too much on the PowerPoints themselves, but I want to establish this. Catholic music follows the Spanish through the Americas. The Greek Orthodox Christianity is pretty interesting because it goes east, making its way all the way to Alaska. If you go up and listen to Alaska natives today, they can sing the Greek Orthodox style of singing. We see the new denominations in the British Isles singing psalms by the 1500s. Then, of course, the Church of England encourages the singing of psalms, and we have that first psalm book in the British Isles, 1542. And the well-known story of the pilgrims heading out from Massachusetts, arrived in 1620. And of course, the very first book we have is the Bay Psalm Book, 1640, singing the Psalms. It's all part of this tradition. So, Muskogee. Many Muskogee. What's that? Oh, you want me to talk right into the microphone? Okay. I figure I'm so loud that it doesn't matter. Okay. At the time of European contact, I'm the teacher, I'm used to moving around. I don't have to be stuck back here. Okay, well, anyway, I'll do my best to stay in place. So, Muskogee Creek people are in Alabama and Georgia, living their lives in what we would call the Idulwa, the towns. The Muskogee Creek Nation didn't exist as it does today. There were confederated towns. They spoke the same language, maybe some different dialects. They all practiced a similar ceremony. And the ceremonial center is around that fire. Fasting was very much a part of the ceremonial religion, celebrating the green corn coming out, and the stickball game that they play. They see DeSoto in 1541, where they encounter the first Africans. War begins by the 1600s as they're caught in the middle of the British and the Spaniards. So very early on, the Creeks are in contact with the Europeans, just about as soon as anybody else in the Americas. The Creeks see more Africans in the 16th, 17th centuries, either as escapees or as slaves of white traders. Interestingly, a lot of the escaped slaves went south into Florida, where they merged with the Seminole. The word Seminole, Seminole, is kind of like a word for the Creeks had for someone who's wild or someone who's taken off or someone who's run away. And so that's why the Seminoles themselves have different bands that are specifically for what we would call Isti Lusty. What's that mean? Isti is person, Lusty is black. Isti Hutki, white person. Person from Asia, Lani, yellow, Isti Lani. Person from North America, originally, Isti Jadi. Jadi means red, red person. That's just the way they call the people. Scots traders start to marry into the Creeks very early on. They take on slaves of African descent for plantation work. And what makes this really interesting is the slaves then can speak both Creek and English. And as we heard earlier, there were people of African descent who could speak Gaelic or Gaelic as well. So some of the early documentation of Creeks going back to England had young African boys with them, like 13, 14 years old, who were translators for the Creeks to the king. Scholars note different status of slaves pre-1815 and a difference between the upper and lower Creeks. The more traditional Creeks as opposed to the ones who started to intermarry and become acculturated. The slaves of the Muskogee typically were more participatory in the society. They were part of the spiritual pursuits, both the Christian pursuits eventually, but early on, the stomp dances that you saw at the very beginning of the presentation. There are some stomp dances that mentions the one with the curly hair. They don't say it's the lusty, but they talk about the ones with the curly hair. They also have important governmental roles, and that's going to continue on. The very first Attorney General of the Muskogee Creek Nation after the Civil War was freedmen, as we call the people of African descent, who were often mixed with Muskogee Creek blood, and after the Civil War, essentially became the landed gentry in many ways of the Muskogee, Oklahoma area, which is where I'm from. And you may or may not be familiar with the Black Town movement of Indian Territory, in which blacks were recruited from the South to come to Indian Territory because there were opportunities for them there. And all black towns were set up in the 1800s. All this integrates with Muskogee Creek history and ultimately what I'll talk about regarding the hymns. We see a lot of land cessions that happen over and over again until what are known as the removals, as Willie referred to earlier, and I saw a sign coming up here on 44 that said, you know, a Trail of Tears marker regarding that. So the Creeks continuously lose their land as part of both treaties and in war. And here is an image of some of these places where the Creeks were originally in Alabama and Georgia. And this is a map that shows the various towns that were there. What's interesting about this is a lot of our Muskogee Creek churches took names from these tribal towns, and when they were removed, gave them to the new places in Indian Territory, often their churches as well. One different one here, that New Yawka right in the center, was a take on New York. So that was New Yawka, and there's a New Yawka, Oklahoma, still yet today. You can see Okmulgee, where it says Old Town. That is contemporarily the capital of the Muskogee Creek Nation in Okmulgee, Oklahoma. Okfuskee is a county. Some of these other places, like Arbica, that is a church and ceremonial ground. Fish Pond is ceremonial ground, where it says Flop Flacco. That's also a church and a ceremonial ground in Oklahoma today, in the modern Creek Nation. So, here comes Christianity. The first missions are established by the Moravians in the 1790s, then the Baptists in 1808. The Scottish missionaries, as I understand it and learned, were not Presbyterian by denominational standard. It was the organization known as the Scottish Society for the Preservation or Promotion of Christian Knowledge, promulgation of Christian knowledge. May have that just a little bit off. In any case, the Creeks didn't want to have anything to do with the religion. They already had a religion. They already had their ceremonial ways, ancient ceremonial ways. But because of the intermarriage between the Creeks and the Scots, there was enough influence to say, hey, we know we need this education. We know we're going to have to learn to read and write. So they agreed to start sending some kids to the early missions there, right on the Alabama-Georgia border. The Moravians were not successful at all and weren't well liked. They stopped their missionary work in 1813 as war really took over the region in that area. The Baptists also saw a little return. After the Civil War, which was between the Creeks, essentially the traditionals and the mixed bloods, and the battle at Horseshoe Bend, where Andrew Jackson, who if you ever go to Oklahoma and you see a $20 bill with a Hitler mustache on Andrew Jackson, you'll know what some Creek person has done to that $20 bill, because that's how they felt about him, because he put thousands of people on the Trail of Tears and thousands died as a result of his policies. You may or may not know the history of the Supreme Court case that still stands as a standard for American Indian sovereignty today. And Jackson said, Marshall, the Supreme Court Justice, Marshall has made his ruling, let him go down to Georgia and enforce it. I'm not going to go down there. So in any case, it's Jackson who defeats the traditional Creeks at Horseshoe Bend, and they continue to lose 25 million acres of land and had very little trust in the American government and really didn't want any part of it. Most Creek people had been run out of Georgia by 1826, either going south to be with the Seminoles in Florida or moving on into Alabama to be with the rest of the Creek people. Whites began pouring into Creek country as a result of the U.S. land acquisitions there and established missions in Alabama. The first mission we know of is in Fort Mitchell, Alabama from 1822 to 1830. This is where the Creek youth were sent for an education, but missionaries being missionaries, they're going to go ahead and proselytize because that's one of the things that they do, obviously. And this is where we believe the hymn singing begins within the Muskogee Creek world. But there's some questions, and these are questions we're working on in a variety of archives and original Creek documents, and it's a really interesting gray area of American history that, frankly, people haven't really been that interested in. The reason why is because Christian aspects of the American Indian world typically do not interest the anthropologist in the same way that the real Indian stuff does. You know, they want the non-influenced by European American Indian stuff. I'll share with you today, I wore this tie on purpose, which I'll kind of share around here. And this was given to me by an Osage lady last summer. I did a talk for her at a youth group. And I sent her an email and said, I'm going to wear your Osage tie up to St. Louis, because the Osage were here, of course. This was their place, and I believe they've even purchased a little island out in the river or something like that of late. I expect some bright lights up there pretty soon. No, I'm just kidding, sort of. But in any case, this is my little symbol that, you know, not all Native people were from the southeast or the Great Plains. Some were, you know, right here, and the Osage were ultimately moved out down in Indian Territory. In any case, in the 1780s, 1790s, the Scots began marrying into the Creeks, sending biracial children to school, and the bilingual, educated, mixed-blood Creeks are really the movers and shakers in the Creek Nation, because they can talk to the Creek people, and they can also talk to the federal officials. So they are the treaty arbiters. They're in the middle of it all. In 1822, baptism and conversion was also perceived as a strategy for avoiding removal. Hey, if I get baptized and I'm a Christian like you say I'm supposed to be, maybe I'll get to stay here where we have been for thousands of years. Of course, it didn't work. Same with the Cherokee, who were totally industrious, built all of their whole society up the way they were supposed to, and they were removed as well. One of the things that we're missing is, I learned this at the first conference we went to, was the Scottish diaries of the missionaries. Number one is missing, was what I learned at the last presentation of the SSP, Presentation of Christian, PCK. So they have two forward, but they're missing number one still. Of course, they're all in Gaelic. So some of these things are still out of our reach at this time. But it makes it really interesting, you know, for scholars or researchers. Where is this information? A lot of it is oral history. How do we know that some of the hymns were sung on the removal on the Trail of Tears? Oral history. Because there's been a long history of distrust between tribes and the federal government because of all the broken treaties. Why, if you can't trust a written treaty by the federal government, why should you trust anything else that the white man wrote? So we're going to keep our own history to ourselves, and we're going to tell it to our children, and we're going to pass it down as oral history. So there's some things we don't know, and I grant that, but it makes for some really interesting conversation. I noticed some books back there that everyone should know about. I found this one here, The Scottish Highlanders and Native Americans, very interesting. However, it doesn't really talk about Alabama and Georgia. It more focuses on the Middle Atlantic. And then how the natives became clergy in the Presbyterian Church, and that could be an interesting line of music research. What did they do when they got a hold of it? And there's some interesting things about that in there, but there's not much at all about the pre-removal Creeks in Alabama and the missions that were there, except what we've learned from oral history and a few little pieces of scholarship that I've unearthed. I bring this song back up. I shared it with you at the very beginning, and I sang just a little bit of it. There's two ways to look at our hymns. What you see here is a pretty modern translation because people kind of like Gaelic. They can't speak Creek anymore. It's your 60 and over people who can speak Muskogee Creek. If you're under 60, chances are you can't. If you're not aware of the boarding school movement of the late 19th century and early 20th century, there was a famous phrase, kill the Indian, save the man. What that meant was let's send the kid to boarding school, let's punish them if they speak their tribal language, prevent that. No tribal ceremonies, we want you to become an English-speaking Christian vocational worker. And so that went on for 80 years. So kids would go and they'd get in trouble for speaking their tribal language, so when they finally graduated and went home and had their own families, they wouldn't speak their language. So we're talking about generations of this taking place. 4 or 5 generations, to the point now where all we can do is try and save the language as best we can. We were talking about this at lunch earlier. Interestingly, a lot of tribes feel that their language's last resting place is in their music because those songs are codified, the words are codified, you can learn the words, and you can learn a lot about the language just by singing the songs. However, our hymnals, the ones before the translated ones, just words. No music, just like all of our other lining out traditions here, it's just the words. And just like Colin was talking about earlier, when the person who's going to lead a song, he doesn't tell you what page, he doesn't tell you what the title is, he just starts singing. And if you know enough of the language, you hear that first line, and you can look it up real fast in the back, and then flip to that part of the hymnal if you don't know it. We have a tiny bit of the lining out tradition left. However, everybody knows the songs. So you don't really need the presenter to say the line because everybody knows what to sing. What typically happens is the leader will start and then everybody will jump in right after him. So let's keep moving here. In 1828, more than 1,300 of the mostly very prosperous mixed bloods, and what we mean by mixed blood is Scottish and Creek, they began setting up plantations in the Arkansas River bottomland, and they did have slaves of African descent. The treaty in 1832 starts the removal, and that is a terrible time. It's hard to even talk about. My son's Creek, I got a lot of family members, thousands of people died on that removal. I'll tell you one thing, let's see if it's this song. No, let me tell you about another song. There's a song called Yama Istimithkidan. Yama Istimithkidan talks about, here I go struggling, here I go suffering. And it has a part that slows down almost as if it's onomatopoeia, it sounds like what it means. So here I go struggling, here I am suffering. Yama istimithkitan tihoyanayov, tihoyanayov, tihoyanayov. Yama istimithkitan. What we're doing there is you're about to fall out. You're about to lose it. You can't take another step. You can't make it. And then, Yama istimith, you pick yourself back up again. So that song is one that we hear they sang on the removal to keep themselves going. I'll tell you a really quick story, since I mentioned the removal, and the Cherokee songs are totally different. They're in harmony. It's almost like they're Southern gospel. They have different parts. On the removal, there were large groups of people among the Cherokee, and what they would do is their own form of call and response. A group in front would sing a line, and they would wait for the next group behind them to sing the line. And then they would wait for the next group to sing that line. And then the next group would sing that line, and once they heard that last group, they would start the first line of the next chorus. And so it's kind of like if you imagine we started Row, Row, Row Your Boat, all the way around. It was similar to that, and they sing those hymns in that way still yet today, but a little faster. One of the things about our Creek hymns is we often hear they're too slow. And I was thinking of what Colin said earlier today about people criticizing the slow Scottish hymns. But because the Creeks were not only influenced by the Scots, but by the slaves of African descent and the blacks who intermarried within the Creeks, they also had a spiritual style. The first Baptist services we know about in Indian Territory were held in 1832 near Muskogee. The church still stands there today. It's called Fountain Baptist Church. It's now an all-black Baptist church. It was led by a